Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past unveils its darkest mysteries. When the lawyer read the will, there was a silence that felt too heavy for the room. I had inherited the estate, a sprawling, rotting mansion tucked into the hills of Blackwood. My relatives, what few were left, called it cursed. I called it home, or at least, I wanted to. The drive there took me through endless fog, the kind that seemed to cling to your skin even after you stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I could feel it, the air was different. Stale, thick, almost expectant. Every portrait, every cracked mirror seemed to watch. But there was one painting that drew my eye immediately. Above the grand fireplace, a man's face, stern and cold, frozen in oils that hadn't aged half as badly as the rest of the house. His eyes, they followed me. I thought it was just my imagination, until that night, when a crash echoed through the empty hall. The portrait had fallen. I hung it back up. The next morning, it was on the floor again. And again. And again. No draft. No loose hook. Nothing. Just the sound of something or someone that refused to stay put. The story begins with an inheritance, one that feels less like a blessing and more like a summons. The narrator, now the last surviving relative of a once prominent family, receives word that an old estate, long abandoned and swallowed by ivy and silence, has been left in their name. It isn't the kind of property people dream of owning, it's the kind that people whisper about, the kind with a history too heavy to ignore. The will itself comes unexpectedly, wrapped in yellowing parchment, sealed with wax that crumbles at the edges. There's no ceremony, no crowd of eager beneficiaries. Just a lawyer's solemn voice reading out a list of possessions that sound more like a confession than a gift. The estate, a relic from another century, sits miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by overgrown gardens and forgotten graves. It's the sort of inheritance that carries stories instead of value, shadows instead of fortune. And this heir was about to discover that the most terrifying part of the house wasn't its silence, but the portrait that refused to remain silent, a painting that seemed to watch their every move with a mind of its own. The narrator isn't quite sure what to feel. There's curiosity, of course, a pull toward the mystery of bloodlines and legacy, but also unease. After all, the estate had been closed off for decades, untouched since the death of the narrator's great-grandfather, whose name is spoken only in half-remembered tales. Relatives avoided the property, claiming it was unsettled. Not haunted exactly, but wrong. There were murmurs of strange accidents, of visitors who never returned, of a portrait that could never remain hung on the wall. None of it seemed real, though. It all sounded like old superstition, the kind of family folklore that grows wilder with time. And yet, the moment the estate was mentioned in the will, everyone else seemed to look away, grateful it hadn't been them. But what they dismissed as superstition was a warning, a truth buried in the family's past that was waiting for the right person, the last person, to awaken it from its slumber. When the narrator finally sees the property listed in the documents, there's an unshakable sense of duty to go. Maybe it's guilt, maybe fascination, but something draws them to that house. They imagine exploring the grand halls, uncovering their family's history, maybe even restoring the place to its former glory. But deep down, there's an instinct whispering otherwise. Inheritance isn't always about ownership, sometimes it's about obligation, or unfinished business. The estate isn't just land or walls, it's a vessel for everything the family tried to bury. The silence of its corridors, the locked doors, the untouched rooms, all waiting for the last descendant to come home and remember what was forgotten. The inheritance marks the beginning of something the narrator doesn't yet understand, a chain that's been waiting for its final link to arrive. And as they would soon learn, some family chains aren't meant to be broken, but worn, pulling you deeper into a history that should have stayed forgotten. Being the last living relative carries a weight that isn't easily described. For the narrator, It means existing as the final echo of a family line that once flourished and then quietly decayed, like the mansion that now belongs to them. Everyone who could have shared the memories, the warnings, or the secrets has long since gone, some to distant towns, others to quiet graves. Their names live only in brittle documents and faded photographs, their faces preserved in portraits that stare from the shadows of the estate's halls. There's no one left to ask, no one left to tell the truth about what really happened within those walls. The narrator's inheritance, then, is not just of property, but of isolation, the burden of being the last witness to a story that refuses to end. This isolation would become a cage, as the walls of the mansion began to feel less like protection and more like a prison, with a single, watchful portrait as the warden. The realization of being the final branch on the family tree begins to settle in slowly. There's a strange loneliness that comes with it, a kind that feels almost inherited itself. The world outside doesn't remember their name, no one whispers about the family anymore. The estate, the name, the bloodline, all of it now exists only through the narrator. What once was pride has turned into responsibility. What once was legacy has become a quiet haunting. Every ancestor had their role in shaping the mystery, but only the last one, the narrator, is left to uncover it. The idea that generations of secrets have been passed down, perhaps intentionally buried, makes the silence around them feel suffocating. The empty halls of the mansion seem to echo with the ghosts of family gatherings, laughter turned to dust, and unspoken regrets that never had the chance to fade. And in the heart of that silence, one regret was louder than all the others, a presence that was no longer content with being just a memory, but was determined to become real again. There's a peculiar tension in being both the heir and the outsider. The narrator has inherited the estate, but not the knowledge that should have come with it. Every decision, every hesitation feels like walking through a life that belonged to someone else. The locals might remember the name, but not kindly. They look at the narrator as though history has returned, as though something that was meant to stay buried has found its way back. The weight of ancestry becomes inescapable, threading through every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the broken windows. To be the last living relative is to stand between the past and the present, knowing that whatever happened before, whatever curse or tragedy lingered in that family, has nowhere else left to go. It ends, or begins again, with the one who remains. This burden would soon manifest in the most chilling way possible, not through whispers or cold spots, but through a painting that was slowly, undeniably, coming to life. The estate had been untouched for decades, a monument to time's indifference and the family's slow descent into obscurity. Nature had begun reclaiming it long before the narrator arrived. Vines crept over the cracked stone walls like green veins, windows clouded with grime blurred the sunlight into dull streaks, and the once grand courtyard was now a wild tangle of weeds and thorns. The house stood in eerie stillness, not ruined exactly, but paused as though it had been waiting for something, or someone, to disturb its slumber. Dust lay thick on every surface, softening the edges of furniture that had once been ornate and proud. The air carried the scent of mildew and forgotten winters, and each step stirred faint motes that shimmered like ghosts in the dying light. It was clear that no one had lived here, or even dared to visit, for an unforgiving stretch of time. But the house wasn't empty. It was waiting. And the thing that waited was patient, and it knew the new heir was coming long before they ever set foot on the property. Rooms remained frozen as if their occupants had vanished mid-thought. Teacups still sat on a tray by a fireplace that hadn't seen flame in decades. A chair had been tipped over near the study door, and a coat hung limply from a hook as though its owner would return any moment. The clock in the grand hall had stopped long ago, its hands rusted in place, marking not the time of day, but the moment the house itself fell silent. It wasn't just neglect that filled the estate, it was resistance. The structure seemed to reject intrusion, as though it had learned to live without people. Every sound, a dripping pipe, the groan of old wood, The soft flutter of a curtain felt deliberate, alive. The narrator would soon realize that these weren't just the sounds of an old house settling, they were the sounds of the house waking up, and it was waking up hungry. The locals had long since stopped coming near it. They spoke of the house like a thing that breathed, that watched, that remembered. Its isolation was not merely physical, it was emotional, deliberate, chosen. The estate's solitude had become its character, its identity. Letters sent to the property decades ago were still piled by the door, unopened and yellowed. The gardens once designed for elegance had transformed into an overgrown maze that swallowed paths and erased direction. The gates creaked when moved, protesting against being opened after so many years of rusted stillness. The narrator could feel the weight of its stillness pressing against them, as though the house was aware of being touched again after so long. The quiet was not peace, it was a kind of suspended memory, a living relic of things left undone. Everything about the estate spoke of abandonment, yet there was a strange sense of expectancy lingering in the air, the kind that made the silence feel like it was holding its breath. And that breath was about to be released in a single, thunderous crash that would change everything. The will was not a simple document of transfer, it was a puzzle wrapped in formality. When the narrator first read through its contents, the language felt oddly poetic, sentences wound in old-fashioned phrasing, clauses that hinted at warnings rather than legalities. There was a line that caught their attention, *, the estate shall belong to the last of our blood, provided they honor what has been sealed and remember what must not be disturbed. *, it didn't read like an inheritance, it read like a command. Every paragraph seemed to conceal a message beneath its surface, as though the true meaning had been intentionally obscured. The lawyer delivering it seemed uneasy, stumbling slightly when he reached certain portions, avoiding the narrator's eyes when questions were asked. His tone suggested he had read this will many times, perhaps for others who had come before, none of whom were left to tell what they found. The document was less a will and more a contract, a deal with a past that was still very much alive, and the narrator had just signed it without reading the fine print. There was no mention of money, no bank accounts, no valuable assets, only the estate itself, left with a list of instructions that made little sense. One section required the new owner to stay at least 1 full week within the house before any sale or renovation could be legally approved. Another specified that certain objects, including a portrait of the family patriarch, must not be removed from the premises. The reasoning behind these conditions was never explained. The narrator noticed faint smudges near those lines, as if the ink had been rewritten or tampered with long ago. It was as though the will had been handled repeatedly, edited by unseen hands to ensure those restrictions remained. These weren't arbitrary rules, they were the conditions of a ritual, a set of steps that ensured the heir would be present long enough for the house to claim what it was truly owed. The deeper the narrator read, the clearer it became that this wasn't a standard inheritance, it was an invitation into something older and more deliberate. There were references to a promise made to the house, and a binding of lineage, phrases that had no place in modern legal language. Even the signature of the deceased seemed unsettling, written in thick, uneven strokes, as though signed in a moment of desperation. The document carried a strange energy, not supernatural exactly, but oppressive in its intent. It demanded obedience. It gave ownership, yet denied freedom. By the time the narrator set it down, the air in the room felt heavier, charged with something unsaid. Every clause of the will. By the time the narrator stepped out of the car, the storm had fully broken. Rain fell in torrents, soaking through clothes within seconds. The house loomed in the distance, half hidden by mist, its tall windows glinting like watchful eyes. Lightning illuminated the facade, cracked stone, shattered shutters, and ivy crawling up the walls like dark fingers. Every flash of light revealed something new, and every moment of darkness seemed to erase it again. The wind howled through the empty grounds, tugging at the trees, rattling loose branches, and carrying with it a deep, hollow sound that might have been the house itself exhaling after years of stillness. When the narrator finally reached the front door, it opened with unsettling ease, as though it had been expecting them. The storm raged behind, but inside, the air was still heavy, stale, and waiting. The storm outside wasn't just weather, it was an omen, a prelude to something awakening within those walls. It was as if the sky had chosen that moment to mark the beginning of the estate's long-awaited return to life. And the first thing waiting for the air inside wasn't a ghost or a monster, but a portrait whose eyes held a terrifying, living awareness. The moment the narrator stepped inside, there was an unmistakable feeling that the house was alive. It wasn't the obvious kind of movement that could be explained by the wind or creaking wood, it was subtler, deeper, like a pulse hidden beneath the walls. The air inside was dense, carrying a stillness that didn't feel empty but aware. Every breath seemed to stir something unseen, and the silence pressed close, heavy with attention. The narrator paused in the entrance hall, droplets of rain dripping from their coat onto the faded marble floor, and for a fleeting second, they swore they heard the house respond, a soft groan, almost like a sigh, echoing from somewhere deep within. The sensation wasn't threatening at first, it was more like being studied, observed by something that had just woken up after a very long sleep. This was not a house in the traditional sense, it was an organism, and the air was a new organ being grafted into its ancient, decaying body. As they moved through the hall, the feeling only grew stronger. The floorboards flexed gently under each step, not in decay but as though the house adjusted to the intruder's presence. The portraits along the walls loomed in the dim light, their painted faces seeming to shift slightly with every glance. Dust swirled lazily in the air, catching faint glimmers of the lightning flashing through cracked windows. There was no sound of vermin or birds, no evidence of nature reclaiming the interior, and yet it didn't feel lifeless. It felt watchful. Even the smell of the air, that mixture of old paper, dried wood, and something faintly metallic, carried the sensation of breath. The narrator's hand brushed the banister, and it was unexpectedly warm. That simple touch deepened the unease, as though the wood had retained some kind of memory, absorbing the presence of those who had lived and died within the house. Doors that should have been tightly shut opened with little resistance, and each room seemed to possess its own distinct energy, some oppressive, others oddly calm, all of them humming with quiet expectancy. The longer the narrator stayed inside, the clearer it became that the building itself was responding to them. The flicker of a candle, the shift of air through an unseen crack, even the low murmur of the storm outside seemed to synchronize with their movements. The house wasn't decaying, it was dormant. It had been waiting for someone to return, someone whose blood matched its memory. The stillness wasn't emptiness at all, it was breath held in anticipation, a living entity sensing that its solitude was finally over. And the heart of this living entity was the portrait in the grand hall, a heart that was beginning to beat once more. The estate stood in complete solitude, stripped of life in every sense of the word. Whatever staff had once maintained its grandeur were long gone, leaving behind only traces of their existence, a broom leaning against a wall, a cracked teacup left on a tray, an apron folded neatly on a chair that had gathered decades of dust. The narrator wandered through hallways that had once echoed with footsteps and voices, but now offered only silence thick enough to feel. Every surface wore a film of neglect. Dust clung to the edges of picture frames, the furniture was draped in cobwebs, and the chandeliers overhead sagged with the weight of time. It wasn't just the absence of people that made it unsettling, it was how complete the stillness was, as if the house had not been emptied but abandoned in a single breath, caught in a moment where everything simply stopped. This abandonment was an illusion, a stage set to make the air feel alone, when in reality, they were never for a single moment by themselves. The kitchen told the clearest story of departure. Pots hung in uneven rows, their metal dulled to grey, and the hearth was cold but stained with old soot. A single wooden stool had been overturned, and the floor near it bore faint marks of scuffing, as though someone had once moved in haste. The pantry shelves still held brittle jars, the contents long since turned to powder. It was the kind of decay that spoke of abrupt desertion, not gradual decline. In one corner, a cluster of footprints had been preserved in the dust, leading nowhere, fading before reaching the next room. The bedrooms were worse. Beds remained unmade, sheets stiff with age, pillows indented in shapes that no longer belonged to the living. The scent of rot and paper filled the air, a mixture of mildew and forgotten perfume. The narrator's every movement disturbed a quiet that felt sacred, as though the house itself disapproved of being touched after so many years of stillness. Even the light that filtered through the curtains seemed unwilling to stay, dimming as if repelled by the weight of history pressing down on every object. Without the presence of staff or caretakers, the house had fallen into its own rhythm, one that didn't rely on human life to function. Doors moved slightly with no draft to guide them, floors creaked without footsteps, and in certain rooms, the dust had settled in patterns too deliberate to be random. The absence of caretakers made the estate feel not deserted but self-contained, like it had learned to exist without people, preserving its silence as a kind of defense. The narrator realized that the house didn't need tending, it had been tending to itself, waiting, watching, and breathing beneath the weight of all that had been left behind. And its attention was now fixed, unwaveringly, on the new occupant. Above the grand fireplace hung a portrait that seemed to command the entire room. Even in the dim light, it was impossible to ignore. The painting depicted a man dressed in the formal attire of another century, a high-collared coat, a dark waistcoat, and eyes that glimmered with something too sharp to be warmth. His expression was neither welcoming nor cruel, but fixed in that ambiguous space between judgment and disdain. The brushstrokes were masterful, every detail preserved as though the subject had refused to fade with time. The varnish had yellowed slightly, but the face remained vivid, the kind of vividness that feels uncomfortably alive. The narrator felt drawn to it instantly, though they couldn't explain why. It wasn't beauty that held them, it was presence. The portrait didn't merely hang there, it dominated, asserting itself over the empty room like a silent overseer. This was no ordinary family heirloom, it was the anchor, the point where all the strange energy of the house converged and focused. The fireplace beneath it was massive, blackened from years of use, though no fire had burned there in decades. The ashes inside were untouched, pale and fine, as if the last fire had been carefully allowed to die. The contrast between that stillness and the vivid life in the painting gave the entire space a peculiar imbalance. The man in the portrait seemed to fill the absence, his gaze steady and suffocating. Even when the narrator moved to another part of the room, they could feel it on them, that quiet, unblinking stare. It wasn't imagination, there was a precision in the way those painted eyes followed, always slightly turned, no matter the angle. The longer they observed, the more unsettling it became. The portrait's eyes became more than a painting's trick, they became a presence. There was intelligence there, something old and patient that seemed to recognize its new observer. It wasn't merely that the eyes followed, it was that they remembered. Every glance felt recorded, every hesitation quietly acknowledged. The man in the painting was not content to be looked at, he was looking back, studying the one who had inherited not just his home, but his gaze. And the first night was when the study would become an active, terrifying engagement. The first night in the estate was steeped in an uneasy quiet that seemed to press against the walls. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with dampness and the faint smell of moss and soot. The narrator, exhausted from the journey and the strange weight of the day, retired to one of the upper rooms where the furniture still stood exactly as it had been left decades ago. The fire had long since gone out, but its ashes still carried traces of warmth, and the faint hum of the wind slipping through the cracks was the only sound in the vast silence. The kind of silence that makes every heartbeat sound like a trespass. The narrator tried to sleep, but the estate refused to rest with them. The walls creaked as though settling, pipes whispered faintly in the distance, and somewhere below, the old grandfather clock resumed ticking despite being stopped when they arrived. It was well past midnight when the noise came. A sharp, echoing thud that reverberated through the floorboards, too loud, too deliberate to be the house merely shifting. The sound came from below, from the grand hall. The narrator sat upright instantly, their pulse matching the rhythm of the rain still dripping outside. For a moment, they tried to rationalize it, perhaps a window had come loose in the wind, or a shutter had fallen. But the storm had ended hours ago. The air was still now, thick and unmoving. The house should have been silent. Yet the sound came again, a heavy impact, followed by a faint scraping, as if something large had been dragged across the floor. Heart pounding, the narrator descended the staircase, each step creaking underfoot, the candle in their hand flickering with every nervous breath. The hall was cloaked in shadow, but as the candlelight spread, it revealed what the noise had been. The portrait, the same one above the grand fireplace, lay face down on the floor. The massive frame had landed with such force that a fine crack now ran through the center of the glass. The hook and nail on the wall were still in place, unbent, untouched. The ropes that had held the portrait appeared perfectly intact, not broken or frayed. There was no reason it should have fallen. Yet it had. The narrator hesitated before approaching, the air suddenly colder near the fallen painting. A strange feeling settled over them, not just fear, but recognition, as though the house had been waiting for that sound, as though the fall of the portrait had marked the beginning of something that had only been pretending to sleep. This was the first act of defiance from the portrait, a clear message that the rules of this house were not the rules of the outside world. The portrait was found on the floor, lying face down, the heavy frame pressing into the dust that had gathered over decades. It was too deliberate to be an accident. The impact had left a faint imprint on the wooden boards beneath it, and tiny fragments of glass from the protective cover glittered like frost in the candlelight. The narrator stood still, unwilling to touch it at first, because the air in the room had changed. It was colder now, though the fireplace sat directly beside the fallen frame. The cold wasn't from a draft, it was the kind that seeps into the bones, the kind that feels aware. The silence that followed the discovery was unnatural. Even the faint hum of the night insects outside seemed to have stopped. It was as if the entire house was waiting to see what the narrator would do next. Kneeling beside the portrait, the narrator brushed away a layer of dust that had puffed up upon impact. The man's face, once stern and composed, was half hidden in shadow, but the expression seemed different now, harsher, angrier. The eyes that had once seemed to follow from above now stared upward from the floor, reflecting the dim candlelight in a way that made them appear wet, alive. The narrator hesitated, unsure if it was just the flicker of the flame or something more deliberate. There was no logical explanation for the fall. The hooks were still embedded in the wall, strong and unbent, the wire taut and unbroken. The portrait hadn't slipped, it had been released. A faint smell of oil and varnish lingered in the air, mingled with something earthy, like damp soil. The narrator reached out and touched the edge of the frame, surprised by the warmth of the wood. It pulsed faintly under their fingers, though they quickly told themselves it must be from the heat of their own hands. Still, that sensation, that subtle heartbeat of the object, sent a chill crawling up their spine. The longer they stared, the more oppressive the room became, as if the walls were leaning inward, watching the act of rediscovery unfold. It took effort to lift the portrait. It was heavier than expected, far more than it should have been. The narrator propped it carefully against the wall, unable to shake the feeling that it resisted the movement, that some invisible force pressed it downward. The storm outside had gone completely silent by now. The only sound left in the room was the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath the painting, as though the house itself exhaled each time it was disturbed. This was only the beginning. The falling was a pattern, a ritual that would repeat until the heir understood its terrible purpose. The narrator decided to rehang the portrait the next morning, convinced that exhaustion and a restless mind had exaggerated the previous night's events. In the pale grey light that filtered through the tall windows, the damage seemed minimal: a small crack across the glass, a little dust scattered on the floor. It looked ordinary again, still unsettling, but no longer alive. The house, too, felt quieter in daylight, though that quiet had its own unease. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the soft groan of settling beams, carried a faint echo, as if the house were repeating each motion a half-second too late. The narrator fetched a ladder, tested the nail and the wire, and found them perfectly secure. There was no reasonable cause for the painting to have fallen. It was simply one of those odd coincidences old houses seemed to collect. Or so they told themselves. It took strength to lift the portrait back onto the wall. The frame felt even heavier than before, its weight pulling downward with unnatural resistance, as if something within it opposed being raised. The narrator forced it back into place and stepped down, brushing the dust from their hands. The room looked complete again, balanced, restored. For a moment, relief replaced the tension that had been tightening in their chest since the night before. They sat in the old armchair by the fireplace, letting their eyes wander over the familiar lines of the man's painted face. The expression seemed unchanged, cold, composed, faintly disdainful. As the day wore on, that relief began to thin. Each time the narrator passed through the hall, the painting appeared slightly different. Once, it seemed to hang a little crooked, though the nail remained straight. Later, the light from the window cast its shadow across the opposite wall in a way that looked like a man standing there, tall and motionless. At dusk, when the wind began to stir again outside, the old house let out its long, tired groan, and the narrator heard a faint creak from the direction of the fireplace. When they turned, the portrait was no longer flush against the wall. It leaned slightly forward, the bottom edge tilting as though tugged from within. That night, as the clock struck the same hour when the first fall had occurred, a loud crash echoed once more through the empty corridors. The narrator rushed downstairs, candle trembling in their grip, to find the painting on the floor again, the same position, the same perfect alignment of broken glass glinting in the dark, as if nothing had changed at all since the night before. The cycle was established. The house was making its demands, and the portrait was its mouthpiece. The third time the portrait fell, the narrator began to understand that something was wrong. It hadn't been touched since it was rehung. The wire remained intact, the nail fixed deep into the wall, unmoved. There was no wind strong enough to disturb it, no tremor in the earth, no explanation that could satisfy reason. The portrait had simply dropped again, always in the same violent way, face first. The glass fractured a little more each time, the frame landing perfectly parallel to the hearth as though positioned, not fallen. The consistency of it was what made the sight unbearable. Coincidence does not repeat itself with such precision. Each time it happened, it left behind the same eerie silence, a silence that carried weight, as if the act had been deliberate and complete. The narrator inspected everything carefully, searching for any physical cause. The wire was thick, still taut and unbroken. The hook on the back of the frame hadn't bent or cracked. The nail in the wall was steady, driven deep into old plaster that showed no signs of giving way. Even the dust that had gathered around it seemed undisturbed, as though the house itself had taken great care not to disturb its own stillness. The fall made no sense, and yet it happened again and again, as though obeying some unseen rule. After the second night, the narrator left the portrait on the floor, half hoping to test the logic of the thing. Perhaps if it were left alone, the house would stop responding. But the next morning, it was back on the wall. No footprints in the dust, no evidence of movement. It was simply there again, restored to its place, staring down with those same unblinking eyes. That was when fear began to take root in something deeper than nerves. It was the quiet dread of realizing the ordinary world's laws were no longer in effect inside these walls. The narrator felt watched, not just by the painted man, but by the house itself. Every attempt to explain away the portrait's behavior made the silence heavier, the air denser. Even the flicker of the fireplace seemed to react to its presence, dimming slightly whenever the narrator approached. There was no sign of instability, no flaw in the material world to blame. The painting fell because it wanted to. The wall itself seemed to release it, as if rejecting what hung upon it. What had once been a mystery of physics was becoming something far more deliberate, a pattern that whispered intention with every crash that echoed through the sleeping house. The intention was clear. The portrait was not meant to hang. It was meant to be something else entirely. The drafts in the house began subtly, so faint that the narrator almost missed them at first. It was an old estate, after all, a maze of corridors, broken windows, and gaps in the woodwork where time had gnawed its way through. But this cold was different. It wasn't constant or natural. It came and went in waves, always in the same place, the grand hall, beneath the portrait's usual resting spot. No matter how tightly the windows were sealed or how often the fire was fed, that corner of the room remained colder than the rest, as if the air there refused to warm. The chill didn't drift, it lingered. It waited. And when the narrator stood too close, they could feel it moving around them, slow and deliberate, like breath. At first, the narrator blamed the weather. The storm had left the house soaked, and the wind outside still whispered through unseen cracks. But even on calm days, the cold persisted, pulsing from that one wall like a heartbeat beneath the plaster. The rest of the house would hold the warmth of the fire, yet that section always seemed to exhale frost. The narrator tested every possibility, held a candle flame near the edges of the window, checked the seams of the floorboards, searched for gaps in the ceiling. The flame never wavered. The air around it remained still. And yet, just a step closer to the portrait's place, the chill returned, the kind that made the skin tighten and the lungs ache. Sometimes, the drafts came suddenly, without warning, brushing past like unseen hands. They carried with them a faint smell, not of rot or damp, but of something older, metallic and bitter, almost like the scent of blood mingled with varnish. The fire would flicker when it happened, bending toward the cold instead of away from it, as if the heat itself was drawn in. The sound of the wind never accompanied these moments. The rest of the house stayed eerily quiet, so that the faint hum of the draft became the only thing alive in the room. The narrator began to notice that the cold always arrived before the portrait fell. Minutes before each crash, the air would thicken and sink, a silence would stretch too far, and then the gust would come not from the windows, not from the chimney, but from the wall itself. It was as if the house exhaled in warning, or in protest. The drafts were not accidents of weather or architecture, they were the estate's pulse, an unseen rhythm tied to whatever force lingered behind that portrait, breathing in the cold life of the place one sigh at a time. This breath was the key to understanding the portrait's unnatural life, a sign that the barrier between its world and ours was thinning. By the fourth night, the narrator began to hear the noises, faint at first, like the soft shifting of wood, the kind of sound old houses make when they settle. But these noises had a pattern. They always came after midnight, when the world outside was asleep and the house seemed most aware of itself. It would begin with a slow creak, somewhere deep within the walls, followed by a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the hall. It wasn't the aimless knocking of loose boards or pipes, it had intent, a kind of cadence that suggested movement. The sound would travel from the far end of the corridor, along the floorboards, and finally to the space beneath the portrait. The first time the narrator noticed it, they stood frozen, candle trembling, convinced they were imagining things. But the noise grew louder, closer, as if something unseen walked the perimeter of the room, tracing the same steps over and over again. The tapping stopped whenever the narrator tried to investigate. The moment light or motion broke the silence, the sound would vanish, replaced by the oppressive stillness that had become all too familiar. But as soon as they turned away, it would start again, not from the same spot, but behind them. Sometimes it sounded like fingernails against wood, other times like the slow drag of fabric brushing along the floor. It was not violent, not even fast, but deliberate. And the longer it continued, the more it began to sound like breathing. At first, the narrator tried to rationalize it. Perhaps rats had nested in the walls, or the wind pushed against some hidden vent. But the sounds never wavered with the weather or the time of day. They only came at night, after the fire dimmed and the air turned cold. More unsettling still, the noise never echoed elsewhere in the house, only in that one room, beneath the portrait's place. On the fifth night, the narrator decided to wait in the darkness, holding their breath, letting the house reveal itself. When the tapping began, it was accompanied by something new, a low hum, almost human, vibrating softly through the floorboards. The hum grew louder until it seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Then, as the clock struck 1, the portrait fell again, with a thunderous crash that shook the air. But this time, before the silence returned, the narrator heard it clearly, the unmistakable sound of footsteps walking away, slow and steady, fading into the far end of the corridor where no one else lived anymore. The invisible resident was making itself known, and its footsteps were a countdown to a terrifying conclusion. After nights of unease, the narrator began to notice something even stranger. The sound wasn't the only thing that moved through the house. Objects, too, seemed to shift their places when no one was looking. It began subtly, with small, almost dismissible changes. A chair slightly angled differently from how it was left. A candle holder that had moved a few inches closer to the window. The lid of the old piano standing open when the narrator was certain they had closed it. They brushed it off at first, blaming tiredness, distraction, or the tricks of memory. But soon, the changes became too precise, too intentional, to ignore. Every morning, something else would be out of place, and more often than not, those things led back to one spot, the grand hall, beneath the portrait. Books from the shelves began to appear stacked neatly on the table, though the narrator hadn't touched them in years. Dust that had collected on certain surfaces seemed to have been wiped away, leaving behind the faint outlines of hands, fingers, or the edge of a sleeve. Once, an armchair had been dragged slightly toward the fire, its legs scraping across the floor as though someone had pulled it close to sit. The first time the narrator heard that sound, the slow, dragging slide of furniture across the boards, they froze halfway up the stairs. When they entered the room moments later, the chair was still moving, just slightly, its last inch of motion completed before stopping as if embarrassed to be caught. More unsettling still, the narrator began to find objects arranged in patterns. A cluster of matches fanned out like rays on the hearth. Coins lined up in near-perfect circles on the mantel. Even fallen leaves that had blown in through the open doorway were gathered into small piles, placed deliberately beneath the window. None of it made sense, yet none of it felt random. The house seemed to be trying to communicate, to arrange its silence into symbols. Every time the narrator tried to clean or restore order, the patterns would return, slightly altered, as though responding to the interference. One night, they left the room spotless before going to bed, every book shelved, every item in its place. When they returned at dawn, the portrait was again on the floor, but this time the candle holders had been placed upright around it in a perfect circle, wicks unlit, wax unmelted, like a ritual waiting for its fire. The house was not just haunted, it was performing a ceremony, and the air was the central component. The unease turned into something more tangible when the narrator began to notice marks on the walls. They started as faint smudges, small enough to be mistaken for dirt or the shadow of candle smoke. But over the next few days, those smudges darkened, stretching downward like the stains of water leaking from behind the plaster. When the narrator wiped one away, another would appear elsewhere, and always near the same part of the house around the grand hall and the staircase that led to the upper rooms. At first, it seemed like ordinary decay, the natural ruin of an old house surrendering to time. But the marks did not behave like stains. They deepened overnight, twisting into shapes that almost resembled letters or fingerprints pressed deep into the paint, as though something on the other side of the wall was trying to push through. The narrator tried to ignore them, but their persistence became impossible to overlook. The marks spread outward, reaching along the corners and ceilings in looping arcs that looked deliberate, patterned, nearly intelligent. When the sunlight hit them at an angle, they glistened faintly, not black, but a deep, congealed red that had soaked into the old plaster like ink. The smell accompanying them was faint but sharp, metallic and sour, the scent of rusted iron left too long in the rain. It made the air heavy, thick enough to taste. The narrator scrubbed at them repeatedly, yet no matter how hard they cleaned, the stains returned by nightfall, darker and more defined than before. Soon, the marks began to concentrate beneath where the portrait once hung. They spread downward like roots, thin veins stretching toward the floorboards. The narrator could almost trace the motion of their growth, as if the walls themselves were bleeding from within. On one particularly cold morning, they noticed that the stains seemed fresh, glistening wet, still dripping. When they touched them, the surface of the wall felt warm, and the moisture left a faint reddish smear on their fingertips. The realization that it was not water struck them like a whisper they had tried to avoid hearing. By then, sleep had become impossible. The narrator would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the slow crawl of those marks expanding through the walls. In the silence, they could swear they heard a faint scratching from within the plaster, the slow, steady rhythm of something alive trying to find its way out, leaving its marks as a message or a warning written in its own dark language. The message was a desperate one, a final attempt to communicate the truth before it was too late. It was only a matter of time before the narrator began to notice movement that could no longer be dismissed as tricks of light or the fatigue of sleepless nights. It began in the periphery, faint, shifting shadows that darted across the corners of vision, gone the moment they turned their head. The first few times, they told themselves it was nothing. The flicker of candlelight against old furniture could easily conjure illusions. But the shadows started to take form, not shapeless blurs but distinct outlines that moved independently of the light. They were tall, angular, almost human in shape, though slightly distorted, as if stretched by the walls themselves. When the narrator looked directly at them, the air seemed to thicken, the edges of reality warping for a fraction of a second before snapping back into stillness. The strange thing about these movements was their timing. They only appeared in moments of quiet, when the narrator paused to listen, when their breath slowed, when the house settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The figures never crossed the open floor, they lingered at the edges of the room, hovering near doorframes and mirrors. Once, while standing at the base of the staircase, the narrator caught the reflection of one in the glass of a framed photograph. It stood at the top of the stairs, motionless, its outline faint yet unmistakable, as though watching. When they turned around, nothing was there. The air was cold enough to make their skin prickle, and the faint smell of oil and smoke lingered for several seconds before fading. Each night, the movements grew bolder. Sometimes, they would pass across the walls in long, fluid motions, as if pacing. Other times, they would linger behind the narrator, visible only as a dark mass that stretched toward their shadow on the floor. Once, the narrator tried an experiment. They left the candles unlit and sat in complete darkness, letting their eyes adjust. At first, nothing moved. But soon, they began to see them, faint, pulsing forms gliding along the far wall, coalescing in the spot where the portrait usually hung. They weren't reflections or the play of light, they moved with purpose, bending around furniture, pausing as if aware of being watched. The narrator's fear became a quiet, suffocating thing, the kind that replaced sleep and made every breath sound too loud. They realized, with a cold certainty, that they were no longer the only one walking the halls of the estate at night. Something else had woken with the house, something that had always been there, waiting in the spaces where light refused to stay. And this something was no longer content to simply watch from the shadows. It was not just the shadows anymore. The narrator began to sense a presence, not seen, but unmistakably felt, as real as the air that pressed against their skin. It followed them from room to room, never showing itself fully, yet always near enough to be noticed. It started as a weight in the atmosphere, a subtle pressure that gathered behind them whenever they lingered too long in the hall. Sometimes it felt like being watched from the doorway, other times like someone standing just behind their shoulder. There was no sound, no breath, no movement, only the undeniable certainty of company. Even in daylight, when the house should have felt safe, that presence lingered, pacing behind the walls, observing. It became a rhythm the narrator could almost measure. The presence came most strongly at twilight, when the estate seemed to draw its first waking breath after the sun disappeared. It followed the narrator down the corridor, its invisible attention heavy and cold. Once, while sorting through old letters in the study, they felt the faintest brush across the back of their neck, soft, but cold enough to make every muscle lock. They turned immediately, but nothing was there. The air, however, held the faint scent of aged perfume, floral but stale, as if drawn from a memory too old to belong to the living. The sensation grew stronger near the portrait. Whenever the narrator approached that part of the hall, the air thickened, the temperature dropped, and a strange vibration filled the silence, too faint to hear, but enough to feel, humming through the bones. At times, it was as though the house itself was aware of the narrator's every move, responding in quiet, invisible ways. The fire would dim when they entered, and doors that had been left open would ease themselves shut without a sound. They could almost sense the mood of the presence, not rage, but a sort of intent watchfulness, like something assessing, deciding, remembering. On one particular evening, as the narrator stood beneath the portrait space, the presence became nearly tangible. The hairs on their arms rose, and a sudden chill spread from the base of their spine to their fingertips. It felt as though someone was standing behind them, so close that if they turned quickly enough, they might catch a glimpse. But they didn't move. They simply stood there, every nerve pulled tight, listening to the silence breathe. And in that silence, the faint sound of footsteps began, slow, deliberate, circling just outside their line of sight, tracing the edges of the hall like a predator walking the perimeter of its cage. The presence was the man from the portrait, and he was no longer confined to his frame. Sleep had become a stranger by then, and when it finally came, it did not bring rest. The narrator began to dream vivid, heavy dreams that felt more like memories that did not belong to them. The first dream was simple, almost still. They stood in the grand hall, moonlight pouring through the tall windows, the house silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock. The portrait was back on the wall, but in the dream, it looked different, clearer, sharper, as though newly painted. The man in it seemed alive, his eyes gleaming not with paint but with wet reflection. The longer the narrator stared, the more the figure in the portrait began to move. It was subtle at first, the shift of a shadow, the twitch of a lip, until the man's expression turned downward into something almost sorrowful. And then, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft but carried through the air like a thought, he said the narrator's name. They woke drenched in sweat, convinced that the sound had followed them into waking. The room was silent, but the echo of that voice clung to the walls, as though spoken only moments before. Each night after that brought another dream, always in the same setting, the hall, the portrait, and the man's voice, which grew clearer each time. Sometimes he wept softly, other times he whispered fragments that the narrator couldn't fully grasp. They heard words like return, inheritance, and once, a phrase that chilled them to the bone, you shouldn't have come back. It wasn't a warning, exactly, more like a lament. By the fourth dream, the narrator realized that what they were seeing was not just illusion. The room in the dream would subtly change to reflect what had happened in waking life, the new cracks in the walls, the furniture that had shifted, even the faint stains that had spread like veins beneath the portrait space. The dreams were mirrors, but older, darker versions of the house, as if showing what it had been before time decayed it. Sometimes, the narrator would catch glimpses of figures moving in the background, servants dressed in clothes from another century, walking silently, their faces blurred by distance. When they awoke from the fifth dream, their heart pounding, they swore they could still smell candle smoke and turpentine, the same scent that had always clung to the portrait. And when they looked up, the man's painted face seemed slightly altered, his mouth curved into a faint, knowing smile that had not been there the day before. The dreams were a bridge, and something was crossing over from the other side. The narrator's dreams grew darker, more insistent, and soon they began to spill into waking life. Sleep no longer marked the boundary between what was imagined and what was real. Sometimes, they would open their eyes and find themselves already standing in the hallway, candle in hand, as if drawn there without memory of leaving bed. Other times, they woke to the feeling of someone whispering just beside them, the words fading into the still air before they could make sense of them. The house had learned their name, not just the voice in the dream, but the house itself. They would hear it sometimes, faintly, drifting down the corridor, spoken with the kind of careful clarity that suggested affection or possession. It was never shouted. It was always whispered, always close. The narrator began keeping a journal, desperate to cling to something rational. But even that turned against them. In the mornings, they would find words written in the margins that they didn't remember writing, short phrases, scrawled in a hand shakier and older than their own. Phrases like asterisk is not gone. Asterisk or asterisk keep the door closed. Asterisk once, a whole sentence appeared that sent a cold shudder through their spine. Asterisk the portrait remembers what you've forgotten. Asterisk it was as though the dreams were bleeding through their thoughts, using their own hand to speak. The ink looked fresh, but when they touched it, it was dry. The line between waking and sleep continued to blur. The narrator stopped trusting reflections, for in mirrors they would sometimes see movement that didn't match their own. Their reflection would linger a half-second too long, or tilt its head in the wrong direction. They tried to avoid the hall entirely, but the pull toward it grew unbearable, a kind of gravitational draw that seemed to emanate from where the portrait belonged. One night, they woke again in front of it, candle guttering low, and for the first time, the man in the painting's eyes weren't looking past them, they were looking asterisk at asterisk them. From that night onward, they began hearing the faint sound of breathing in the walls. It was steady, rhythmic, too slow to be their own, and it followed them wherever they went. The dreams no longer waited for sleep, they came in fragments throughout the day, a flicker of movement in the corner of vision, a voice calling softly from another room. The house was awake now, and the narrator could no longer tell whether they were living in its memory or it was living inside theirs. The invasion was nearly complete. The heir's mind was becoming a shared space, a battleground they were rapidly losing. It was around this time that the narrator began to notice changes in the portrait itself, not subtle, imagined shifts of expression, but clear, undeniable alterations that no trick of light could explain. The crack in the glass, once shallow and delicate, had deepened overnight into a jagged line that cut straight across the man's face. Yet the damage wasn't what disturbed the narrator most. It was the colors. The once faded tones of the painting seemed to have revived, growing richer and darker, as if the oils had been freshly applied. The man's skin now had warmth to it, a faint sheen, and his eyes, once dull with the wear of time, gleamed wetly, reflecting candlelight like real eyes might. The narrator could swear that they shifted with the light, following movement across the room with an awareness that felt alive. At first, the narrator blamed exhaustion. Weeks of sleeplessness had warped their senses, no doubt. But each morning, the painting looked different again. The background behind the man seemed to darken, the faint outline of a window that had once been painted behind him gradually disappearing, replaced by what looked like a deep, swirling shadow. The man's posture changed, almost imperceptibly at first. His shoulders straightened, his hands, once folded politely, began to separate, as if slowly preparing to move. The more the narrator looked, the more it seemed the painting was not simply altering, it was advancing. One morning, after a night of particularly restless sleep, the narrator entered the hall to find the portrait crooked, hanging askew as if it had been wrenched sideways. When they tried to straighten it, their hand froze halfway. The man's expression had changed entirely. Where before there had been a stern calmness, now there was unmistakable malice, a faint smirk that hadn't been there before. The corners of his mouth curled with something that looked like recognition. His eyes, glimmering unnaturally bright, met the narrator's with such precision that it felt like standing before a living person. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the candle flame bending toward the floor as if pushed down by an unseen hand. That night, unable to sleep, the narrator returned once more to the portrait and saw something new: faint, dark smudges on the inside of the glass, near where the man's hands were painted. They looked like fingerprints, pressed from within, the marks of someone trying to push their way through. When the narrator leaned closer, the surface fogged slightly, as though the painting itself had exhaled. The portrait was not a picture of a man, it was a man, trapped and struggling to get out, or to pull someone in. The changes in the portrait became impossible to ignore. Each morning revealed some new and inexplicable detail that hadn't been there the day before. The man's once pristine collar was now slightly open, the neat folds of his coat wrinkled, as though he had shifted within the frame during the night. The shadows behind him grew deeper and more complex, no longer flat strokes of paint but layered, textured darkness that seemed to recede endlessly into some unseen depth. The narrator found themselves staring longer than they meant to, unable to look away. The painting drew them in with a quiet gravity, a slow and suffocating pull that made time lose meaning. It was as if the boundary between the portrait and the room had begun to dissolve, and what had once been confined to canvas was beginning to spill outward. Soon, the portrait began to change even in plain sight. One evening, while tending to the dwindling fire, the narrator felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. They turned their head just slightly, and in that instant saw the man in the painting blink. It was not a trick of reflection, it was slow, deliberate, and horrifyingly real. The eyes closed for a fraction of a second and then opened again, the faintest trace of motion rippling through the painted skin. The narrator stumbled back, the candle nearly falling from their hand. When they looked again, everything appeared still, yet the sense of movement lingered, vibrating faintly in the air like an echo. From that night on, they avoided the hall entirely after dark. But the portrait made sure they could not forget it. They began hearing soft, muffled sounds coming from that direction, the faint scrape of frame against plaster, the creak of the nail, the almost imperceptible whisper of cloth brushing glass. Once, while lying in bed, the narrator heard the sharp metallic clink of something hitting the floor. When morning came, the portrait had fallen again, face down, but this time, the frame was splintered, and a faint handprint, smeared and dark, marked the inside of the broken glass. Each time the narrator rehung it, the man's appearance shifted further from the original portrait they remembered. His eyes had darkened, the expression growing crueler, more defined. Even the background seemed to pulse faintly, like it contained movement beneath the paint. The narrator began to realize that the painting was not simply depicting him, it was becoming him, adapting to mirror their own fear, their own exhaustion, as though the house itself had chosen to make that connection permanent. The connection was a two-way street. As the portrait became more real, the air was becoming less so. The changes in the portrait became impossible to ignore. Each morning revealed something new that hadn't been there before, details that no brushstroke or trick of light could explain. The man's posture, once rigid and composed, seemed to shift subtly, as though he were in the process of standing from his seat. His clothes, once flatly painted, appeared to have gained texture, fine creases at the sleeves, folds that caught the light in a way that real fabric would. Even the colors seemed wrong now. What had been dull, muted browns and grays were rich and wet-looking, as if the paint hadn't dried in centuries. The shadows around him deepened, too, growing more defined until they seemed to move on their own. When the narrator passed through the hall, the sensation of being watched no longer came from the memory of eyes, it came from something alive and aware. The narrator tried to ignore it, convincing themselves that madness, not the supernatural, was taking hold. Yet, the portrait demanded attention. It began to draw the light from the room, swallowing the glow of the candles until the edges of the hall were lost in dimness. The figure within it seemed closer now, his face clearer, his expression sharpened into something that was no longer distant or dignified but intent. When the narrator looked directly at it, a faint pulse of warmth radiated from the frame, subtle at first, then rhythmic, beating in sync with their own heart until they stepped away. Then came the motion. It was small, a blink, a flicker of muscle near the jawline, so human that for a moment, the narrator's mind refused to process it. They turned, hoping the illusion would break, but when they looked again, the man's gaze had shifted. He was no longer looking past them, but directly into their eyes. The sense of distance between canvas and observer was gone. He was there, sharing the same air, the same silence. That night, the narrator awoke to the faint sound of wood creaking and glass rattling. The noise came from the hall. When they entered, the painting was swaying gently against the wall, as though recently touched. They watched in frozen horror as the frame tilted forward on its own, paused mid-fall, and then righted itself, not by chance, but with careful, deliberate control. The man's painted hand now rested against the inside of the glass, fingers splayed, as though testing the thinness of the barrier that still kept him inside. The barrier was failing. The thing inside the portrait was testing its limits, and it was finding them weak. The narrator's grip on reality began to unravel as the portrait's changes grew more aggressive. The days bled together, marked only by the shifting features of the painted man whose presence now dominated every corner of the house. Meals went untouched, sleep came in fragments, and when it did, it was filled with sounds, the scraping of nails on canvas, the dull thud of something heavy against the walls, the soft sigh of breath that didn't belong to them. The narrator began locking the door to the hall, yet somehow, every morning, it stood open, the portrait perfectly straightened as though someone had taken care to maintain its display. Dust no longer gathered on its frame, no matter how long they avoided it. The rest of the house aged and decayed before their eyes, but the painting remained pristine, vibrant, impossibly alive. They started to hear the house itself respond to the portrait's moods. The wooden floors groaned in rhythm with the flickering of the man's painted gaze, and cold draughts carried whispers that resembled the cadence of breathing. One afternoon, while standing in the parlor, the narrator felt a vibration in the air, a low hum that seemed to originate from the direction of the hall. It grew louder the longer they listened, until it became almost melodic, a voice beneath the noise, faint and indistinct, muttering something that sounded like pleading. The narrator pressed their ear to the wall and realized, with creeping dread, that the sound wasn't coming from behind it but from asterisk within asterisk the portrait itself. Driven by both terror and obsession, they tried to destroy it. They tore it from the wall, hurled it across the room, shattered its glass and ripped at the canvas with trembling hands. The moment the blade sliced through the painted surface, a gust of cold air filled the hall, strong enough to extinguish every candle. The smell of iron and old earth flooded the space, heavy and suffocating. In the brief silence that followed, they heard something wet move behind the torn fabric, something that shifted and breathed. When the light returned, the painting was whole again, untouched, hanging perfectly where it had been. After that night, The narrator began catching glimpses of the man outside of the portrait, a reflection in the window, a silhouette at the far end of the corridor, a face watching from the stairwell in the brief moments before sleep claimed them. The painting no longer confined him. It had become a doorway, and whatever lived within it had already begun to cross through. The destruction of the portrait was impossible. It was not a physical object that could be destroyed, but a metaphysical one that had to be fulfilled. The house no longer felt like a structure made of wood and stone, but something breathing, pulsing, alive in a way that defied logic. Every sound carried meaning, every creak, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls seemed deliberate, purposeful. The narrator had grown accustomed to the chill that never left the air, but this was different. The temperature would shift with the painting's moods, plummeting into cold so sharp it burned the lungs, then warming suddenly, as though something unseen had drawn close. The once comforting scent of old varnish and dust was gone, replaced by the faint metallic tang of blood and the sweet rot of decay. The estate, once their inheritance, had turned into a living mausoleum, a place that listened, remembered, and responded. Objects began to move without human touch. A chair would drag itself half a foot across the floor overnight. Doors would open just wide enough to invite a glance into darkened rooms before slamming shut again. Even the light seemed manipulated, candles flaring brighter when the narrator spoke aloud, dimming when silence returned. The portrait had become the heart of this disturbance, the axis upon which the entire house revolved. It was no longer simply hanging there. It commanded star. One evening, while trapped in restless wakefulness, the narrator heard footsteps moving slowly above them, deliberate and heavy. The estate had no second floor. The sound traveled across the ceiling, pausing directly over their bed before fading back toward the hall. They rose, candle in hand, every instinct screaming to flee, yet their feet carried them to the portrait instead. It greeted them in silence, the man's expression now unmistakably aware. His mouth had changed, it was no longer a painted smirk but an almost imperceptible curve, the suggestion of movement, like a breath drawn in anticipation. The narrator tried to pray, to recite words meant to repel darkness, but each syllable seemed to wither before it reached the air. Their reflection in the glass no longer mirrored their expression. It lagged, delayed, and then smiled when they did not. For the first time, they realized the reflection wasn't theirs at all. It was his. The man inside was no longer content with observation. He was studying them, learning, waiting. Every attempt to leave the house failed. Doors that led outside opened only into other rooms. Windows showed no landscape, only endless fog. The narrator understood then that the house had folded in on itself, a trap, a body with the portrait as its beating heart, and they were now part of its circulatory system. There was no escape. The house was a living entity, and it had already begun to digest its new occupant. Sleep abandoned the narrator entirely. When they closed their eyes, the darkness behind their lids was no longer empty but filled with flickering shapes and faces that pressed close, whispering in tongues that scratched at the inside of their skull. The man from the portrait appeared there, too, but not as an image. He stood in the shadows of their mind, half-formed and breathing, his presence a suffocating weight. The narrator began waking in strange places, once in the dining room, once at the foot of the hall stairs, once standing directly before the portrait with one hand pressed against the glass. Their fingers would be cold, damp, and trembling, as though they'd been gripping something living. It was no longer clear where dreaming ended and waking began. Time distorted inside the house. Days seemed to stretch endlessly, then collapse into hours that vanished without memory. The clocks stopped keeping proper time, their pendulums swaying at irregular intervals, sometimes even backward. Shadows moved independently of light sources, gliding along walls in directions that make no sense. The narrator began hearing faint laughter in the moments before dawn, laughter that grew clearer each day, low, masculine, and familiar. It was his laughter, echoing softly from every corner, as if the walls themselves were remembering him. One night, in a moment of exhaustion and desperation, the narrator sat before the portrait and demanded to know what it wanted. The air thickened, the candlelight guttered low, and a sound like the stretching of canvas filled the room. The painted man's lips parted slightly, the faintest suggestion of a smile breaking across his face. A whisper emerged, not from the painting, but from behind it. It spoke the narrator's name, dragging each syllable like a caress and a curse in one. They stepped back, heart hammering, yet the sound followed, circling them, close enough to feel the breath of it. After that night, the narrator found themselves repeating words they didn't understand. Phrases scrawled on walls, muttered under their breath without memory of having spoken them. The house responded. The floorboards pulsed faintly when they walked, a heartbeat underfoot, and the air shimmered with something unseen but watching. The narrator began to realize they were being shaped, their body weakening, their mind thinning like the portrait was pulling something out of them, layer by layer. It was not merely haunting them anymore, it was consuming them, painting them into itself one breath at a time. The air was not the owner of the portrait, they were its pigment, its medium, its final layer of paint. The transformation of the narrator's world was nearly complete. The estate no longer resembled the place they had inherited, it had become an extension of the portrait's will, a labyrinth of corridors that seemed to shift when unobserved. The air hung thick with a scent that was neither dust nor decay but something far more intimate, the smell of breath, of flesh. The walls pulsed faintly, as though veins ran beneath their surface, carrying the rhythm of some unseen heart. Every object had begun to hum with quiet vibration, a resonant undertone that grew louder the closer one came to the hall where the portrait hung. The painting was no longer still. Its surface rippled subtly, as though brushed by invisible fingers, and from its depths came faint sounds, a whisper, a heartbeat, a sigh. The narrator's reflection vanished entirely from mirrors and glass, replaced by fleeting glimpses of another figure, the man from the portrait, standing where they should be. He would appear for an instant, his head slightly tilted, expression unreadable, and then fade back into the surface. The narrator covered every mirror, but his image found other ways to return, in the gleam of polished wood, in the shimmer of water, even in the glint of the doorknob at night. Wherever they looked, there he was, not fully there yet, but closer each time. When they tried to flee the estate, the outside world resisted. The front door opened only onto blackness, a vast, soundless void that swallowed light. The windows, too, no longer revealed the gardens or the grey sky but only the same unbroken darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The narrator realized that whatever the portrait had done, it had sealed them within its own reality, a place that obeyed different laws, a prison made from oil, canvas, and memory. The voice of the man began speaking directly to them, no longer a whisper or echo but a presence that filled the room like another person. He spoke gently at first, telling them that the house had been waiting, that the portrait had always belonged to him and would soon belong to them as well. His words carried warmth, persuasion, even affection, but beneath that tone was something cold and absolute. He told the narrator that every heir who came before had tried to fight it, and every one of them had failed. The estate was not a legacy but a lineage of captivity, and now it was their turn to take their place within the frame. The final act of the inheritance was not to receive the house, but to become part of its permanent collection. The voice grew stronger with every passing hour, no longer confined to the hall but echoing through every corner of the estate. It was calm, deliberate, and patient, speaking not from the air but from within the narrator's thoughts. Sometimes it sounded beside them, other times behind, but most often it came from within, as if it had found a home in their very breath. The man from the portrait began addressing them by name, his tone soft and knowing, each word sinking into their mind like an old memory resurfacing. He told them stories of the house, of the people who had lived and died within its walls, each tale ending the same way, with a painting hung, a name forgotten, and a voice that remained. He spoke of inheritance not as wealth but as a cycle, a duty that could not be refused. The narrator stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped fighting. Their reflection never returned, and soon, neither did their shadow. The house no longer felt like a place they inhabited but a body they were being absorbed into. When they tried to speak aloud, their voice came out strange, layered, deeper, almost blended with another tone that wasn't their own. It was as though the voice of the man had merged with theirs, speaking through them even when they remained silent. The portrait now exuded warmth, an unnatural pulse that matched the rhythm of their heart. When they pressed a trembling hand to the glass, they could feel it, the faint throb of something alive on the other side. The whispers that once came from the painting had become words, clear and commanding. "Come closer," it said, and they obeyed. "You were never the heir," it said, "you were the replacement." The man's face within the frame now looked younger, his skin vibrant, his eyes bright with vitality. All the life the narrator was losing seemed to flow into him. The painting was no longer content to depict, it was taking. The color began draining from the narrator's skin, replaced by a pallor that resembled aged varnish. Their fingers stiffened when they tried to move, their joints tightening as though being painted into place. The world outside the frame blurred, edges melting into a haze of muted tones. The narrator could no longer tell whether they were standing before the painting or already within it, whether the breath fogging the glass was theirs or his. The transfer was almost complete. The essence of the air was being siphoned into the portrait, rejuvenating its occupant while the air faded into a memory. The final night arrived without warning, though the house seemed to sense it before the narrator did. The air was heavier than ever, filled with a static hum that pressed against the skin like invisible fingers. The walls trembled softly, not with sound, but with breath, slow, measured, and synchronized with their own. The portrait, now impossibly vivid, glowed faintly in the candlelight, its surface alive with shifting depth. The man inside was no longer a painting, his gaze was no longer paint and pigment. He looked out with awareness, his eyes wet and glistening as though he were standing just behind a thin sheet of glass. When the narrator approached, the faint fog of his breath appeared on the inside of the frame, answering theirs on the outside. It was not two beings facing each other anymore. It was one divided by a final, thinning barrier. The voice spoke clearly now, no longer echoing from distant corners but from the space between their heartbeats. It told the narrator that the estate was a vessel, a keeper of souls bound by legacy. Every heir who had come before had resisted, and every one had eventually joined the portrait's silent company. The figures that filled the long hallway, the other portraits that lined the walls, were not ancestors but predecessors, each face frozen at the moment of surrender. The realization struck like a chill: the portrait was not cursed. It was a continuation, an inheritance of identity, passed from one unwilling heir to the next. The house did not choose randomly, it absorbed bloodlines, preserving them in pigment and canvas for eternity. As the candles flickered and died one by one, the narrator felt the warmth drain from their limbs, a sensation both terrifying and seductively calm. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of oil and iron, and the edges of their vision began to fade into sepia tones. Their body no longer obeyed them. Their reflection appeared once more on the glass, merging with the man's face until there was no distinction between the two. A faint smile spread across the image, not theirs, but his, before the last light went out. When dawn broke, the house stood still and silent. Dust floated through pale morning light, settling on the frames that lined the hall. The portrait hung perfectly centered, the man inside restored to youth, his expression serene and knowing. His eyes followed the empty corridor with quiet familiarity, and in the faint reflection of the glass, a second face lingered behind him, watching, waiting, as if the cycle had only just begun again. As the shadows of this unsolved mystery fade into the past, the secrets of history await you. Subscribe now to Secrets of History, and join us as we unearth more chilling tales from the abyss of time. Hit that bell icon, and let the past whisper its truths to you next time.